Hello, and welcome to my senior project presentation. Today I will be discussing my senior project, the physical portion, as well as the research paper itself to show what I have learned over the course of the senior project period. So there are certain portions of history that would be considered common knowledge, such as World War II and the end results of that war. However, there are aspects of history that aren't as well known, such as my senior project, which focused on the history of McCall. And my intention of this presentation isn't necessarily to teach that history, it's more just how to, or the way I try to convey information in an easy to digest format, something that could help people learn a little bit easier and maybe a little bit faster depending on that person. However, before I get into the main presentation, I'm going to get into my research paper first. So my research paper was essentially about the evolution of teaching and how it has changed over the course of the more or less on the United States itself, not the concept of teaching, but more just um, the evolution in the United States. So, it was really ever since the colonies really started. So there, which is kind of the general idea. So the evolution of teaching here in the US is more or less since the colonies started, and the first school was actually known as the Boston Latin School. And my paper also detailed the pros and cons of this evolution. My research more or less detailed more negative aspects than positive. However, the positive is still there, and the cons, for instance, are more about technological advances proving to be superior in certain aspects, such as helping convey information easier than people can. However, teachers, on the other hand, are more, they can understand the student a little bit more. They can try to adjust that teaching method, which a computer will have difficulties to do. And I also detailed potential remedies to the situation or to the idea of teaching, which mostly was just trying to make like a combination of the two, like a excuse me, a which is what schools do, but more in the sense that a video can be used with a teacher conveying information easier, essentially. And the connection to my project, it's essentially what I would do or what I think would be a good way of teaching, essentially. Now, my main uh, project was on going to locations around the town and basically just going with my mentor, Mr. Vendegna, who unfortunately he isn't here at the moment for me to talk with him or show a picture of him. Essentially, I would go to different locations with him that ranged from McCall to Cascade, depending on what the topic was, and talk about and learn about these events in McCall's history. And these were more or less the two most important locations of my entire project because the library was one of the first things I did for my project. I had to go and research in the library as well as my own independent studies. And I did this with my mentor. We did this throughout the summer, and it was a very long and tedious process, but we did get a lot, or I got a lot done thanks to Mr. Vendegna's help. Now, Browns Park doesn't seem like it would be that important. However, it is important to a certain aspect of the town's history, specifically where the railroad used, or essentially where the sawmill was in McCall. It was a very important aspect of McCall's history, which I couldn't leave out. And Mr. Vendegna and we worked a lot trying to gain all this information so I could present it in an easy to digest format, as well as record myself knowing all that information and essentially just trying to understand it so that way I will have an easier time presenting it. So this is the URL to my project, which is uploaded on YouTube as of now, which I will be showing you now. Hello, my name is Alec Wallen, and I will be presenting the history of McCall in a brief overview. Hello, my name is Alec Wallen, and I will be presenting the history of McCall in a brief overview. Hope you enjoyed the video. Anyway, so I will be teaching the history of McCall in an easy to understand format using pictures and things of that nature. Well, where do I start? Well, let's start from the beginning. Now, the area that was McCall wasn't actually called McCall. It was actually, um, it was founded by Finlanders who were living in the valley at the time. The Finlanders that lived during that time period, or at least within the area, were actually they were quite, not necessarily strict, but they were very specific in how they did things. They prohibited alcohol, and they were very religious people, which this took place in the 1880s. In 1891, Tom McCall moved to the area that would be known as McCall, and it was named after him due to the fact that he was wanting to create a homestead, which essentially means that he was trying to create farms for people to live on. The people who lived within McCall and the town itself was considered wild and woolly due to the amount of gambling and essentially what used to be strip clubs that existed within the area, and even to the point where handguns were even allowed into bars without a license until the early to mid 1980s. Now, McCall during this time period was in a very interesting state because it basically was just founded. It had been over 30 years since the initial foundation, or at least since Tom McCall moved there. So the backbone of McCall's economy was very much based on mining and lumber. Mining came first, and that was due to the amount of gold that was in the western region, including Idaho. After mining, a sawmill was produced on the lake where Rotary Park is, which is somewhere in town, I don't even know. So anyway, after seeing that lumber could be used to build homes effectively with a sawmill was produced in the 1920s. Now, there was a regular pattern for these sawmills. They would be created, burned down. And this happened over and over and over and over, very much to the same sawmill until the last sawmill closed down in 1977, until it inevitably burned down in 1988. Now, what was used to transport all this lumber from the sawmill was the railroad that used to exist within the town, which was pulled up in the 1980s. The railroad was used as a way to transport that lumber from McCall down to Boise. It passed through the middle of town, and it made its way down to Cascade, where the mill there get the wood from there, and then take it down to Boise through the Northern Union Pacific Rail Line. Now, the Northern Union Pacific Rail Line, was also used for transportation. It was used to transport visitors from the Boise area to come up to McCall, so that way they could get away from the heat, or that was the main argument at least. Now, McCall itself was basically running off of this format for a long time, until the late 1980s when tourism was starting to grow, especially from the city areas such as Boise.
In 1924, to alleviate the boredom in McCall, a man named Corey Engen, an Olympic ski champion and resident of McCall, decided to create the Winter Carnival, which was used as a competition. Approximately 70 sculptures would be created, and they would be used in a competition, which and in McCall is still done today, and approximately 10,000 residents, or 10 to 50,000 residents, usually attend over the course of 10 days. Now, we don't now McCall doesn't do this as much anymore or if at all, but what they used to do also, aside from the sculptures, they also used sled dogs for races, of course, because competition. So, to finish off today, which is filled with a bunch of information that you may or may not remember, but that is very subjective, of course, let's finish off with a bit of trivia. So in 1938, there was a little film called Northwest Passage being filmed here in the McCall area. The film starred Spencer Tracy, and it was essentially about men trying to take resources from the Native Americans that lived in the area, which then led into a whole other story arc. Now the film was it was filmed in McCall in 1938 and wasn't released in theaters until 1940. The film was actually a major hit, and it led to many different spin-offs and TV shows of that nature. However, the film itself had always been it always desired to get a sequel, but it never did. So, so there you go, Macaulayans. You can't say this town isn't important enough. All right. I'm very passionate about that. Anyway, McCall is a very interesting town with a very interesting backstory, and those who live in it should at least have a brief overview or understanding of what's going on, because if they don't, it doesn't matter to them, so it's not like it really is a big deal. Oh yeah, and one last thing. I know I'm wearing a Dungeons and Dragons t-shirt, and I know it looks distracting. All in all, I thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.
To conclude my presentation, essentially my purpose for doing this was to show how I would teach if I were given the opportunity, especially on certain topics that aren't as well known, such as the history of McCall. And I believe that this method could be utilized as an easier way of presenting information, very much like a crash course video or just any form of information that can be conveyed electronically. This research has changed my view of the town because I have lived in it for most of my life, and for the longest time, I never actually knew the information about the town or its history or where it even came from. And because of this, it helps me understand why the town is the way it is and why and how it has changed over time, going from mining and lumber to a tourist town that helps, which is essentially the new current or the new way that the town earns money. And I will not forget this information as this town has affected my life, and I am glad to have lived within it, and I am glad to have learned the information about it that helps me understand the town a little bit more. So that is my senior project, and I would like to thank whoever is watching the video to judge, and I appreciate the time taken out of your day to look at what I've learned and how I intend to use this experience for the future. Thank you. This is my senior project, and have a good day.